Well, hi, everybody. This is Merle Robinson. I'm one of the organizers for the National Security Decision-Making Game, and I'm going to introduce a couple of my co-conspirators here in just a second. One is Mark McDonough. Mark, please say hi and introduce yourself to the folks.
How do you do? I'm Mark McDonough. I'm a co-founder of a National Security Decision-Making Game. Been playing it for about 30 years now and running it for about 30 years. I'm currently broadcasting from southeastern Connecticut, the Groton, Connecticut area, for reasons that you might imagine. And I'm happy to be here today. Thank you very much.
Okay, and another one of our staffers is joining us today is Doug Samuelson. Doug, please give you a quick introduction.
Hello, I'm Doug Samuelson. I run a little consulting company called Infologics Incorporated in Annandale, Virginia, which is a suburb, Northern Virginia suburb of Washington, D.C. And I've been doing all kinds of analysis and wargaming stuff for a long time, and then joined the NSDMG about a year ago, Merle?
Yeah, about that. Okay, so we're here with the Armchair Dragoons Convention, and for most of this presentation, I'm going to put the presentation on screen, and we'll be available to talk in the background to the slide deck. So I'm going to put the presentation up and put it in full mode so everybody can follow it. Basically, this is a presentation designed to give people an orientation on the kinds of things professionals often look at as they develop games. And in particular, what we're going to talk about is a new game that we're planning to design that we've just started the process on the American Revolution. So I'll start off giving you a little background about who we are and what we do, and then we'll get into the details. So, who's the National Security Decision-Making Game? Well, we're basically a not-for-profit corporation with a mission to educate the public on decision-making processes. And this is all volunteers. Nobody gets paid. There's no money involved so far, although we hope we'll find somebody to donate eventually. Basically, we're devoted to understanding how world decisions are made, sharing things we learned along the way, and we have people in the team that are military, government, academic, and business members. All our stuff's public information. All the information you hear is based on public information. There's no secrets or anything like that, even though several of us have worked for the Department of Defense or a government here or there. We have a fair number of staffers that come from Canada and a few from other places, so we are pretty eclectic. Where can you find us? Well, you can find us in a lot of conventional places. We do academic events. We've done stuff for WinSec down at Fort Benning. We've done National Defense University, Ball State, Campbellsville, a number of those locations, but we regularly appear at hobby conventions. And generally our games are focused in such a way that we deal with the differences in audience. We tend to be a little bit less historically accurate at game conventions because they like to have more fun. And we tend to be very rigid and more simulation historical when we're in an academic environment. So essentially what we do is we run games and simulations and seminars. We have our long games, which we call mega games, that run 6 to 8 hours. Our standard games now at conventions are 4 hours, and we have crisis games that run as short as 2 hours. We do experimental games on things like the Cold War. We do primarily things on the 1960s in the Cold War and contemporary world. We've also done some near future and science fiction games, and we do seminars on just about any topic, historical or fiction, that we find interesting and we think the audience will like. So what are our games about? Well, our games are live action role-playing games where people use negotiation and other levels of change to remake the world to match their vision while dealing with circumstances, intelligent opponents, friction, dynamic situations, and other imponderables. So what we're going to talk about in this presentation is game design. And for those of you who are serious about game design, here are 3 of the key references a lot of our colleagues use. U.S. Navy War College document on fundamentals of wargaming, the art of wargaming from Peter Perlin, Zones of Control, which is a compendium of articles by professionals. This particular game, what we try to do in ours is we look at underlying design requirements. We run multiplayer live action events, so that's the format that we're aiming at. Players have roles that represent groups that have common interests, agendas, and resources. So generally, there's social groups, sometimes administrative groups, and sometimes organizations that you would recognize as an organization. We also have positions that move around. For example, somebody can be elected president, and that has a lot of administrative and executive branch officials that work for you, which expands your ability to control and influence events. Players in our games are organized in cells. They're generally national cells, but not always, and they're not teams because they're not a team. It's every person for themselves, just as in the real world. All players have agency, which means they get to make choices that make a difference. And we lean heavily towards simulation, but as in all games, you have to have a trade-off between complexity and simplicity to play in the time frame and to manage things, so you're not trying to run a recreation of World War II in real time. We also do adjudication in our games with an educated and skilled staff, so there's a lot more free play in what we do than what you see in other organizations. Staff expertise is needed on all critical aspects of the game. Even our facilitators get trained to know what the boundaries are and what the capabilities are. And we have an after action session, and we allow reasonable time for that so that people can talk about why they did that crazy thing. Our minimum play requirements are we have to be able to train the game in less than a quarter of the time. So if we've got a 4-hour game, we need to basically be able to train in half an hour and debrief in a half an hour. So that's about a quarter of the game time. All groups need internal and external tension. We don't want to run a country or a group that has no dynamics that they have to make decisions about. Decision groups generally have to have odd number of players because in a convention setting or public venue, you don't want them to have a deadlock in the game. 2 and 2 leads to no action. It's simplified and modified to make it fun, and if they aren't having fun, they're not learning anything, because essentially what we try to do is give people background and information on the historical periods and the subjects that we're covering as part of the game. And at the end of the game, we do talk about the things that are absolutely real and the things that are speculation, so people know where the jumping off points are. Also, I'll point out to Mark and Doug, please pitch in at any time, because I tend to move fast with this, but I want to be sure that we get input from everybody. So this is a sample that looks sort of like what we do at our games. It's a military professional LARP setting. It has a formal structure, has a trained staff, has designated roles, has guides and rules, and expert adjudication. You have player groups that represent cells. In some games, they'll be colored to talk about the red cell, like your opponents, or the blue cell, like your friends, the white and gray cells for people who might not be friends or enemies, and they'll talk about the mechanics and structure. So this is just a very simple example of the kinds of things professionals game. Okay, in our games, players have to have agency. And when we talk about agency, it means all of the things that are in this chart. They have to have objectives for the group, context in the game, options in the game, consequences, and the opportunity to see the consequences of their actions. They need to be able to make choices on priorities, and then at the end of the game, we'll review what they did, and they have to be able to implement in the game. So what we're going to do in this session is use one of the common models that people use for development and structure in military and professional gaming, and that's what's called PMESII-PT. And basically, it's a model for verifying inclusion of all the relative attributes of the problem or the thing you're simulating. So we will cover political, military, economic, social, information, infrastructure, physical environment, and time elements related to the American Revolution in the example we're going to give you today. Okay, so one of our first questions was when we should start and when we should end. So we had a lot of discussion about, do we start with the Stamp Acts? Do we start with the Townsend Acts? Do we start with the Boston Massacre? Mark, would you like to chime in on this because of the kind of debate that we had?
Yeah, the one of the questions is what audience we're dealing with and what we want to teach to whom. I'd certainly be interested in, and we've been interested in saying, advertising this to high school and university level, undergraduate level. And it'd certainly be easy to teach someone something by putting them in a game context and walking them through the end of the 7 Years' War, through the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, and they could start to see, and we'd pitch it, introduce it as injects to the players in such a way that they would begin, the American team at least, would begin to get a feel for how outrageous some of the Americans at the time felt these acts were, and how one thing would lead to another would have fed their decision-making process. I expect most students would come out of such a game with a pretty clear idea of what the Stamp Act was, when it was, and what it started to set into motion, and what the sequence of these events was. In the end, we're sort of culminating though in a decision to start the game with the coercive acts in 1774. That's still up in the air. Well, we might revisit that, and it also might change because we're likely to be introducing a couple of different game variants here, depending on what audience we're going to use. But that's when actual violence started to ensue as a routine thing between the British occupation soldiers in Boston and the colonists pushing back, setting aside, of course, the Boston Massacre as one event, one night. And we're likely to try to take this game forward a couple of years to try to induce the entire rebellion in terms of when the tipping point reached that a Continental Congress is actually willing and ready to declare independence.
Yeah, and one of the key things that we had in our discussion was, at what point is a revolution actually inevitable? Because we don't really want, for game purposes, people to negotiate their way out of a game in the first 15 minutes. So you have to get to a point where a conflict, particularly possibly a military conflict, is guaranteed to start, but how it's resolved is variable. So if we started with something like the occupation of Boston, there's not much in the way of violence that's gone on. And one of the other considerations, and we'll talk about this briefly later, is the speed of communication. Because if they occupy Boston, it takes about 3 months for the rest of the colonies to know what's going on, and another 3 months for their reactions to come back to Boston. It's even longer when you're going to Europe. So those are key elements. So one of the other pieces of this was to try to figure out, should we be turn-based or simultaneous? Often in our games, we have an unstructured time system where things happen at a general pace and there are certain milestones or benchmarks. One of the things that we were looking at was the communication cycles during the period, and we'll talk to that a little bit more further along. So some of the issues that we also have had some side discussion on, and I don't want to make you think in any way that we're at a finished product. This is very early in our process. Our process is probably about a month and a half in, and it generally takes us, because we're volunteers working part-time, 6 months to a year to get our preliminary design, and a year or two before we get it refined to the point where it's fully fleshed out. For example, here we expect there may be several different cells, one for the Patriots, one for Loyalists, one for British agents, and we'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. But each one of those cells, we may start the first prototype of this game with just Patriots. So one of the key things are what precedes the game and what things are injects for the players to react to, and how much information do they need, because this is not in the hearts and minds of the current generation. If you say, what was the Townsend Act to the average person that comes to a hobby convention, or even the average undergraduate student at the university, they may not be able to tell you. So we have to have enough background in the game and in our briefing materials and in the injects so that they know what it is that they're making a decision on, or know what the news, the impact of the news might be. So one of the big things is player education. You know, do they know enough about the choices to play? Do they understand some or none of the ramifications of their choices? And one of the things that's an option is if we need a course of action menu. There are many groups and organizations that use that. It tends in some ways to stifle play because what it creates is a limited set of choices. If all they look at is your menu, they don't realize all the things they could do. And what we want them to be able to do is make the same kinds of choices that people during the period would. So
yeah, I'd want to point out also there's a trying to educate players today as to how their counterparts 100, 250 years ago would have felt as difficult. We've been finding that problem at an academic level, teaching, again, trying to get college students and high school students to act as if they were decision makers in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. They're too easy to find accommodation or common ground between the U.S. and the Soviets. Not really looking out for their national interests insofar as just they're bending over a little too easily. So we have to make sure a reasonable amount of proper realistic tension is maintained between the players so that the game is going to keep moving on in a reasonable manner.
We also may want to spend a little more effort explaining to people what the weather was like then. On the slide where you had the list of events, you had the harsh winter of 1779 to 90. I think you meant 80.
Yeah.
But the fact is that all the winters in that period were harsh, and that affected people's outlook.
And we have an audience question, which is, given the topic with an early start, how do you deal with the risk of massive divergence without railroading? And that's exactly what we've been trying to look at. Early starts are not something we're likely to do with this design. We want to get to the point where people have already started mobilizing, so they have to make other choices or compromises. And one of the big things we'll talk about is what I call gestalt briefing, because a good part of what we need to do in our training for players is to try to get them into the mindset of the era. And we'll talk a little bit about that in particular when it comes to economic theory for the revolution, because that's a big deal, and you'll understand it in just a few minutes. So one of the other things that we often do not do in our regular games, but we sometimes have done, is have particular components of play that are designed around leaders, because sometimes leaders have a big impact. Saddam Hussein, for example, had a big impact in Iraq, George Washington in the United States. So the question is, if you've got somebody that's that important, do you make them unkillable in the game because they're essential to telling the story or the historical situation? So one of the questions that we're still debating on is if we need some kind of leadership impact, if we need cards or elements that depict key leaders, that has some advantages for color and depth on people getting an understanding and a feeling for the period. But we also have to be careful, because one of the things we've seen in the past is if one person has a leader card and a whole bunch of other people don't, they feel like they're less important, which isn't really true. So, one of the other pieces of this is what kinds of things are automatic, what kinds of things are abstracted. So those are things we're still working on, but to give you the background, it's to help you understand the kinds of things that we have to think about. So, when we talk about where we're at and where we're going, right now we're looking at maybe trying to field an experimental 2-hour game this summer that'll basically cover from like 1774 or 1776 to 1783. It might have a course of action menu, and it's basically designed to test the Patriots. The Loyalists and Crown elements are things we may get into next year. If we wound up with lots of volunteers or somebody very energetic, that schedule could accelerate. So now, one of the things we're going to cover next is some of the background things we've learned about the revolution. And some of these things we're going to unlearn as the process goes on, because certain basic history, the records have gotten further research, and when you use general sources, sometimes you find that there's additional information. So just to give you some of the background geographically, this shows some of the key geography. And then one of the other things that we started to think about when we talk about geography and players and components is what things are the trigger thresholds for change in state? Because if you start the game with the French as a cell, for example, or the Spanish and Dutch as cells, there's a tendency for players to get active long before they actually did. And when you look at the historical pattern, because we're trying to provide a simulation and an approximation of the environment for players to make valid decisions about, when you look at the indigenous peoples and the natives, there was limited activities where native tribes got active or inactive, primarily in the north and central parts of the frontier early in the war, early in the process going up to like 1777. There were bystanders, for example, when the British troops go through the Carolinas and burn a bunch of stuff, people who were sitting on the sidelines get activated. And then from 1777, 1788, 89, the natives, particularly in the South, become active in a new way. And in each case, when native tribes get activated, they can also get inactivated because of different events. There are discussions about how certain tribes were intimidated by military force, certain instances where there were negotiations and peace treaties made. All of those things are an element of the equation. The French didn't enter the war until they thought the Americans really could win in a significant way. And they wanted revenge for the French and Indian Wars, as we talk about it, or the 7 Years' War in Europe, as they talk about it. The Spanish joined the war after the French had been in for a year, and the Dutch joined because the British declared war on them because they had said, hey, don't give naval stores to the French or the Spanish. And the Dutch said, wait a minute, our last treaty said we could do that. And the British said, we don't care about the treaty. And if you are not going to agree to change it, then we're going to attack you tomorrow. Have a nice day. That's sort of the basic background. So now we're going to walk through the kinds of things we look at using that PMESII-PT model. So one of the things we start looking at is groups, policies, procedures, and leadership under the political aspect. So you've got King George and the British Parliament are key factors, and the Continental Congress and committees of correspondence. So we started having the debate, how many sides and who has agency in the period? And when you started looking at it, we talked about patriots, loyalists, British agents. We also talked about whether we needed to have some of the British players based in England and what impact that would have. We also came up very quickly with certain cells that were unsuitable for players that needed to be done with staff facilitators. Prussia, Austria, and Russia, all three, were heavily involved with the partitions in Poland, and Russians with a war with the Ottomans. The Spanish had a war with Portugal before they entered the war in North America, and Indians tended to only react to major supporter atrocities. So the other piece of this is each one of those powers, the question is, what did they have to gain? And they really didn't have, for the most part, navies that could significantly affect the outcome, except for the Spanish. So essentially, we made a decision very early on that we didn't need to have Prussia, Austria, Russia, the Ottomans as players with agency, because they weren't going to have anything fun to make a decision about. So after a significant discussion, we basically think we have got a basis of the model, which is that the patriots, the loyalists, and the crown agents in North America will be a team, and we will facilitate the crown in England, because British policy in England is also kind of an imponderable because of Lord North, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But right now we're thinking those are the only viable multiplayer cells. And one of the things that we also are interested in is whether we can basically make it a single cell or solitaire game like our Cuban Missile Crisis game, where we do just patriots or just loyalists or just crown agents in a game as a further development downstream. Mark, do you have any other comments on this?
No, you basically got it covered. We just think that the European side focused on London is going to be a game in and of itself. It's going to require a whole lot more, and I'm not sure there's going to be that much more a great deal of interest in the people on this side of the Atlantic. as the 250th anniversary of some of these events is arising. So we've tabled that as a possibility for later, but right now we're going to be trying to focus on events on this side of the Atlantic and use inputs from London as our control mechanism to try to inject events, force the Crown agents to do things here that might not make sense to them, and also try to impose on the players who are, most of whom are used to picking up a cell phone and talking to somebody in Pakistan if they wanted to, what the implications of a 3-month round trip travel for a message back and forth are going to do on your decision making process, especially when you're following orders from that guy at the other end of the process.
Yeah, and one of the things that we looked at here was, because there in general was a 3-month out and 3-month back delay on message traffic from North America to the Crown, and we'll talk a little bit more about that further on in the presentation. If somebody like Cornwallis says, I need reinforcements, it's 6 months before he gets an answer, and it's maybe 9 months or 12 months before he gets reinforcements, because the message takes 3 months to get there. They have to decide what they're going to do. They have to start that process and mustering people and paying people and building supplies and then ship them to North America.
Now,
So,
for that reason, people like the General Gage, General Clinton, British generals in charge of the colonial forces, they had a lot of autonomy. And they knew they had a lot of autonomy, and London recognized that they were having to grant them a lot of autonomy for local actions, to raise local forces, to spend a lot of money, to bribe people if necessary, to buy things, and in large respects, these colonial governors were the local king's agent, and they recognized they had to do things often without getting information from London. So that's why I think that it would be a good model to give a lot of these Crown agents functionally the authority to do what they see as necessary within constraints that they feel the law and physics allow.
yeah. So some of the other areas that we looked at was whether or not these groups had enough agency or activity. And the issue that we came back to was every one of them was inactive for a good part of the period. So unless we want to have an early French entry as being a distortion to the history, we need to establish some kind of a threshold, or we need to make it an immutable event so that it happens on a particular schedule. And the immutable did not seem to be an appropriate way to handle it. So at this point, all of these things are variable, and we'll go back and talk about our threshold item at some point in the future. We're not going to address more of that this time because we're still working on that. But we've got to figure out what's going to make these groups active or inactive, and whether they will stay active once they start, or whether there's something that'll kick them out. For example, if the Spanish lost certain territories, would they drop out of the war? And those are the kinds of things we need to be evaluating. So the next thing you start to look at is, who would people play? And I've played with this chart a little bit since we had our group discussion, because there are a couple of different ways we can do it. And for the Patriots, the question is, do you do it by regions or states? And who has significantly different agendas? Because one of the things we often see in our games is, for example, if we look at the United States, the Democratic Party has lots of factions. So we tend to make players different factions of the Democratic and Republican parties when we play in those games. In the colonies, there were some very distinct and regional as well as specific to state differences. And that's one of the things that we still need to look at. But one of the things we also tried to get a rough idea of, and this is not cast in stone at this point, is how we would staff it. Because generally you need at least 5 to 7 players to run a particular cell to have it be effective from a social dynamic standpoint when you're running a live action role play. And you don't want it to be more than about 21, although there are some examples where we've run cells as large as 52 people. Now we've got another audience question, which is, what would prevent a live war in Europe? Well, that's a great question. And the answer is they had several live wars in Europe, but they didn't have an impact on the New World. For example, Spain had a fight with Portugal. The one impact is they got Uruguay back. The Russians had fights with the Ottomans, and there were some issues for European balance of power. But for the most part, that was just impacting them. The Austrians and got involved with the partition of Poland in part to compensate themselves for what they thought was a perceived increase in power by the Russians vis-a-vis the Ottomans. So, there's that issue. And then there's the question of what they had to do to occupy Poland once they divided it between the Prussians, the Russians, and the Austrians, which tied down a lot of military forces and funding. So coming back to our design for the American colonies, when you look at Patriots, there are four distinct areas that were different that we can identify: the middle states, the Chesapeake, the northern states, the southern states. And when you look at population, and we'll show a chart later, their relative strengths are roughly the number of players we tossed on here. And the frontier seems to have its own agenda. So it's one of those things we've put as an optional possibility. So that's just sort of our straw man to get us started. So then the question is with Loyalists. Well, Canada was an interesting situation that affects this as well, because generally when we talk about Tories and Loyalists, the indications are somewhere around 20 to 25% of the population originally were supporters of the monarchy. And over time, a number of them moved to what's called Upper Canada, where they were normally referred to as Tories or Whigs. And so you had the locals who are of English or British extraction. And then you had Lower Canada, which was primarily of French extraction. And then, of course, there's the twist with Catholicism, because one of the other things that comes into this is, at least vis-a-vis Quebec, and whether or not Quebec would potentially join the revolution or if it was going to oppose the revolutionaries and support the king, was the issue that they had just been fighting colonists in 1763. And there were still a lot of leaders that felt that animosity from fighting colonial forces, even more so than they seemed to be upset with the British. It's interesting how that works. Another thing we'll talk about briefly is the Quebec Act, which was a method by the Crown to try to get a certain degree of loyalty out of the Catholics in Quebec and in other locations. But we'll address that a little bit more later. And then, of course, the Loyalists had native tribes that were allied with them from the beginning and stayed allied with them. And then there's the other question. The colonists and Patriots originally thought that Nova Scotia and St. John's, which is now Edwards Island and so on, might join the revolution. And that's one of the things we need to look at, but we don't have a good handle on right now. And then, of course, there's a question about how do you build crown agents in America? Now, we know there's going to be civil agents, and the question is how many and where, because a number of the civil authorities in the colonies ran. The governor of Massachusetts in particular left the country. Military commanders, do they need to be regional? Do you need a naval commander at the beginning? Do you need a naval commander as the game moves on? Do you facilitate a naval commander? If you have military commanders, how many do you need? Well, there's some hints on military, and we'll come back to that. But that's still up in the air. We sort of know we need to do it. We don't know how to do it yet. And then, of course, the question of crown factions in England. What's interesting, you see my model, I still have stuff that isn't related to the presentation. The Prime Minister and the Loyal Opposition were the primary groups. Prime Minister was Lord North until the great defeats in 1778. And his opposition was William Pitt the Younger. And the king basically supported Lord North through the whole situation. So the question is, what do you have to do if you're in England? Well, Lord North's policy was, bring these unruly subjects to heel. They are subjects. We are a feudal kingdom, a monarchy. And that's something that we figure we were going to have a lot of trouble getting players to play accurately. So making that a facilitator sort of makes sense. Having the orders come from England to colonial crown agents seems to make sense. William Pitt the Younger in the Loyal Opposition was very big on government reform, particularly things that allowed the Catholics to have more participation in government and to become loyal subjects of the king. So the Quebec Act comes in. We'll come back to that again. Another key English issue was they had a lot of debt left over from the 7 Years' War. Debt they had, but how to translate that into relative strength and to compare it to French debt, which obviously was a factor in their entry or non-entry, and American debt is a problem because converting currencies is an issue almost as complex, it seems, as the Cold War estimates of the size of the Soviet economy. So we're still working on that. So one of the big things is this fixed attitude that the Brits had. You know, it seems like, first of all, for game purposes, if we let players do anything but discuss a change to these bring the unruly to heel policy, there won't be a game because it'll basically be a peace negotiation. At the very most, there would be some kind of limited colonial autonomy. But one of the things that's very clear is their policy was the more troublemakers make trouble, the more there's going to be a response to send more soldiers, give locals more authority, loosen the rules of engagement for crown agents. Doug or Mark, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, that we say there is no game if, in fact, the British decision makers in London are too willing to give a high degree of autonomy to the rebels and to not treat them as subjects, as you pointed out, Merle.
Yeah. Okay, so
there's another whole game about what's going on in London.
Yes.
And I don't think it's possible to bring that into the North American part of the game as it is at its current state of development without making it too complicated to play.
And one of the other considerations, both for the European option for war and dealing with internal British politics in England, is the American Revolution is probably one of the best resourced and researched topics in history. However, the European aspects of it really aren't available in English very well and don't seem to have the same level of research. When I started trying to look up things like details on the partition of Poland, details on the wars with the Ottomans, details on the war between the Spanish and the Portuguese and what the motives were and who the actors were, I'm not finding a lot. And if somebody in the audience knows good references for those things, or in particular knows good references about the internal politics in Parliament and the King's agents in England, that would help us to know, because at the very least, it will impact the kinds of injects we give those that are working in the colonies, whether they're crown agents, patriots, or loyalists.
We could plunge into a 4-hour lively discussion of the effects of certain ideologies across the Atlantic over that period. One of the unintended consequences of the American Revolutionary War was that Lafayette, who was sent by the French crown to help the rebels undermine British colonial authority, got all these radical ideas, mostly from George Washington, and went back and turned a unit during the storming of the Bastille and turned the rebellion into a revolution.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows what all the things Benjamin Franklin did in London and Versailles during the war. He may have been a double agent. It's very, very hard to parse out the intel side of the war, which most people just don't even think about.
Yep, and one of my theories right now, the more I'm getting into it, is that Benjamin Franklin was a spy master and we just don't know all the details. And I'll talk about that very briefly later because it's a theory based on minimal evidence, but there are a lot of indicators that make me think.
There's evidence that he was, and you know who our top spy master was George Washington.
Yes.
He's quite good at it.
As we move through the PMESII model, the next thing that we talk about is military. And by looking at military, it also will help us figure out the roles that we put for British Crown agents. For example, there were 3 major fields, theaters on the ground. Up until 1778, when the French entered the war, you basically had North, Central, and South with separate commanders. And they had separate strategies too. So that's kind of a useful breakout, which tells me we're probably going to have at least 3 British military officers as player roles in the game. And then there were minor theaters like the attacks back and forth on and from Canada, the Northwest Territories, okay, and the Deep South, which were relatively minor. And up until 1778, there's no separate naval war worth playing because the British dominate the situation so massively. So at least for the bulk of the game, you're going to have 3 military commanders and maybe an adjunct.
By the way, when you refer to the Northwest Territories, you mean like Ohio, right?
I mean everything west of the Ohio River and west of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Everything, everything north and west. Because essentially that territory was stuff that the Brits had conquered from the French in the 1763.
Yeah.
On the naval front, there might be some play to be had with the lakes and also with privateering, but that will be minor. That'll probably hit the cutting room floor.
Yeah, that was what I was afraid of, because there were battles up by Plattsburgh on Champlain, and there were some things on Erie, but not to the degree you see in the War of 1812. Now, this is just a benchmark. This is the Wikipedia numbers. I stole them fair and square. That gives you a rough idea of strength during the war. One of the things that is interesting to note is that in North America at the beginning of the war, and I mentioned this in one of the other charts, the Brits had 8,000 troops. There's no way they can fight a war with 8,000 troops against a continent in rebellion. So one of the first things they did is they went out and hired German mercenaries. And there was a lot of debate about that. And I've got a slide where we'll talk to that just a little bit, and at least one of the fundamental sources that I found to look at. This is sort of a benchmark to show you where the big battles were. Notice even though we essentially have a Southern military commander, there were no major battles. I mean, probably the biggest one was, I think, Cowpens. So that's a different issue, but it sort of gives you a sense of the focus of the game. Now, what happens in 1778 is a revolution became a world war. And one of the things that really changed was the number of theaters that were involved. I think Mark is most eloquent on this. Talk about how the number of theaters changed and their relative importance.
Well, yeah, I mean, up to the point where where France had entered, it was just a local conflict in North America. Sure, we sent privateers. John Paul Jones was involved at that point early on, but it was just these colonies, which were British colonies, and the British trying to retake their colonies. Once France got involved, it was 7 Years' War Part 2. And of course, France had holdings all around the colonies and territories all around the world. So did England. And suddenly, all of these feel a need to go try to launch some operations against each other. Trade routes by both nations around the world are at this point coming under fire. One of the things you notice is even in the Americas, there was a seasonal aspect to it. In the winter months, the fighting moved to the Caribbean between France and Britain. And we in the North American colonies could largely try to reconstitute and try to hunker down until the snow melts. And then when the spring came, the fighting moved back into the colonies again. But this is a characteristic of two great powers, and the colonies, I'm afraid, weren't a great power at that time. This is a characteristic of two great world powers duking it out for control over the world.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd like to point out, and I'm having some difficulty getting hard data, is that when you look at the areas of the world that had value to England, one of the key things to understand is there's a difference between economic activity and income. Because, we've learned a couple of things. One is that the American colonies were about 40% the size of the English economies based on estimates of people in the period. And that they expected that North America would outstrip, both in population and economic strength, the Crown in England in just a couple of decades. What's interesting, though, is that didn't translate into income because the American colonists had been very lightly taxed, which was one of the big issues that came out that created the American Revolution. The West Indies, on the other hand, had about 1/5 of European trade was in sugar, and 4/5 of it came from the West Indies. So in terms of income to the Crown, because income was primarily based on tariffs, it was West Indies was the #1 producer of revenue for the Crown in the period. And then India, which basically, as the English took more control there, they got a monopoly on saltpeter, which is used for gunpowder, tea, and money. So, essentially, when you look at this, when the revolution becomes a world war, it goes at least to 4 theaters, and England wins 3 of the 4. They win the Indies, they win India, they win Europe. So when you start talking about why the British made peace with the colonials, the cost was too high, and the actual return was expected to become so low. Other considerations during the period that we need to talk about, and we'll hit them a little bit more later in the presentation, is leadership, supplies, communication delays, and travel time. And when you look at it, you look at a map like this, the thing that's interesting to note is the amount of text you have in certain places shows you relative population. And we'll hit that in another slide too. So the real question for the game is, what defines victory? Is there any win other than the colonials becoming independent? Is that a guaranteed result? And if so, is the question how the English survive the world war that comes from it? Or is there a possibility for them to win against the colonists? Mark, Doug, you want to pop in on that? Because we haven't got a consensus on how that should work.
Well, one outcome that was a lively point of discussion in England was, is it subjugation or independence? Are those the only possible outcome states? The answer is clearly no. Barbara Tuchman in The March of Folly points out that all along there was an alternative everybody knew about, everybody talked about. It was better than what they got, and they didn't think of it. You give semi-independence, they're still under the crown, like Canada.
Yeah, make them independent.
Yeah, a high degree of autonomy is largely the starting situation prior to the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. All the a great up until about 1777 or some.
You just did a fade on.
Mark, try that again, because you bounced in and out on audio. Oh, looks like he's frozen up in the background. So I'll wait for him to come back. We'll move on, and we can come back for him if we need to. Okay. So one of the other things that we mentioned was mercenaries. There was quite a bit of debate amongst the English about whether using foreign mercenaries was a plus. They hired about 30,000 Germans, and that had an impact on the Patriot reaction. Oh, it looks like Mark is back. Mark, did you have more comments you wanted to make on that?
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that slowly the hearts and minds of the colonists moved over towards saying, yes, the only real outcome we could accept at this point is independence. But prior to the French and Indian War, there was a great, since the Glorious Revolution at the turn of the century, there had been a high degree of autonomy given to the colonies. And it was only when the British started to say, okay, you are our subjects, and impose the Stamp Act and try to pay their debts. The British are saying logically, we just went into deep debt in the 7 Years' War trying to defend you. So you have to start paying some of that back. But the taxation without representation question started to become a rallying point. But what I'm trying to say is, slowly the American colonists began to say, okay, we've suffered too much and we need to go independent. But up until about 1777 or 78, an accommodation which just went back to the status quo ante, where the colonies had a high degree of autonomy, local governors, etc., would have been acceptable to a lot of the Americans, including probably a lot of people who signed the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. So mercenaries, I think we've covered enough. I just wanted to point out what a large proportion they were early on in the war in particular. Here are a couple of interesting anecdotes that I came up with, and I'm still trying to find out how accurate they are, but I tend to think they are. One was about British supplies, and I'm not going to read them to you, but basically it's the fact that they could not push supplies into the hinterland beyond the navigable parts of the rivers because they really didn't control the hinterland. The locals did, and the local patriots were active enough to basically deny those areas free passage of supplies and goods. The other thing is, to realize this is a hearts and minds battle. And when you look at it, Yorktown shouldn't necessarily have ended British options in North America. They still had a lot of war to go. But what's interesting is they basically lost heart and said, we're not going to get what we want. If we're not going to get what we want, we need to quit. So in some ways, it was like Vietnam. And I don't want to overplay that analogy at all, but I want you to understand it has an impact in that it's psychological. Okay, so when we talk about stuff, here's the one chart I think is also very useful, is the one on the right.
Merle,
Shows population per square mile. Yes.
since you mentioned Vietnam, is there an issue in here that the local agents and allies of the British in North America are running a black market selling weapons to the rebels?
That's possible, but there's a lot of evidence that the Spanish and French and Dutch in particular were doing a very lucrative trade in arms from the Indies, and that some of those arms were financed even from the very beginnings of the revolution by both the French and the Spanish. So there was cash sales of munitions and arms from all three's citizens in the Caribbean. There were probably profiteers in Canada and on the frontier, not real clear. But there definitely was federal government support from the French and the Spanish early on. They were basically extending credit and giving the colonials access to ports like they were an independent power, in violation of the normal standards of the time. Because normally only flagged vessels of real nations were given port privileges and a whole bunch of other things. And because mercantilism was the order of the day, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, that's an issue. But the thing I want to point out on this chart is notice the population density. One of the things for strategy I've wondered about and is not real clear is if you look at inhabitants per square mile, if the British occupied just the green areas of that map, could they have suppressed or won the war? Because you don't really think about it. I mean, they didn't have good census data. There wasn't a lot of information out there. But the bulk of the population, by far, was between, Williamsburg and Boston. Something to think about. Don't have an answer to that, but it's something we need to explore, because if it's a viable strategy, we don't necessarily have to suggest it to the players, but if they try it, we need to know how to deal with it. Some more background. Now, this is one of the things that's really interesting, because, we worry about the mindset of modern people playing in historical situations. And, in the 18th century, people assumed the world had a limited supply of wealth, and the question was how it got distributed. It was all a mercantilist system. The goal was to get as much of the wealth as possible by selling goods to other countries in exchange for gold and silver and hoarding the stuff. Adam Smith didn't publish Wealth of Nations until 1776, and he was a minority opinion. So that's kind of interesting. But here's the other thing that's interesting when you look at the economic situation. Americans made so much money in terms of relative sense. Their standard of living in the colonies was higher compared to England and most of Europe. They could meet their basic needs and afford to buy goods that were considered luxuries like tea. By the 1760s, the colony's economy was 40% as large as the mother country. And the population of the colonies was 1/3 of Britain's and growing faster. They also had abundant land, resourceful people, and they weren't getting the crop failures they got in Europe. So basically, you had the richest people in society were the ones that were most upset when the government affected their lifestyle. So when we talk about things like 9/11, was it poor people that were the terrorists that took down the tower? No, they were rich Saudis. So when you look at it, the people at the highest end of the economic scale are the ones who become most dissatisfied and get animated and activated.
A friend of mine who has studied quite a bit of military history says that the lesson of the Revolutionary War that the British learned and never made the mistake again is whatever you do, don't anger the most rich and powerful people in the population you're trying to control.
Yeah, exactly. So we have another audience question, which is why didn't the colonies pitch in together and buy a few rotten boroughs to get representation? That is a great question, and I don't have a great answer. But you also have to realize that it would have gotten a lot of attention and would have had its own ramifications. I mean, William Pitt the Younger was very much about trying to eliminate the 13 rotten bureaus, I think it was, that he identified in Parliament. And that was a major fight. And he lost, but the thing that's interesting about it is, had the colonials been recognized as doing that, how much more of a reaction you would have had from the English in England. I think it would tend to have exacerbated the situation rather than made it better for them.
They may have feared that's what was going on. That may have been part of why they were, at least some of them were so adamant.
Another piece of this that's going on behind the scenes, and again, because the level of documentation isn't there, is this whole triangular trade business. Because you have to realize that in essence, Britain prohibited certain kinds of manufactures from being done in the colonies.
Yep.
And what that basically meant is North America was considered a resource extraction zone. And the resources that were being extracted were tobacco and sugar. It wasn't only until after the Revolution, as we move into past the War of 1812, that cotton becomes an issue. And you've got the slave traffic, and you've got rum. Because essentially you've got sugar being turned into rum, and rum, tobacco, and sugar being shipped out of the New World. Okay, and then you've got slaves coming in. And that triangular trade is an underpinning piece of everything else that's going on, but we don't have good numbers. So we're going to have to deal with approximations and estimates. And the best thing we probably can do is use the locals' estimation and the people during that time period's estimation. But it's anecdotal. It's one of the same problems we run against when you start to look at the War of 1812 and resourcing and the cost of government fighting. I've done that before. And that's an exercise in futility, even with congressional circular letters. So one of the pieces of this is the triangular trade in slaves. And just to give you a sense of in the period even, here's a couple of extracts. This is sort of their equivalent of census data in the period. And you look at the middle colonies, look at the proportion of whites and blacks. And then go to the South. It's more than, it's just close to 40% is black in the period. So this also tells you something about the dynamics of political power. The only people in political power when you talk about the Patriots or the Crown are the whites. And it's important to understand that there are a lot of bystanders, which is the black population. I haven't seen any evidence of slave revolts during the Revolution. If somebody has something on that, it might be useful because it's at least a useful sidebar in the game and maybe a useful mechanic. So here are a couple of other things that I was able to find about revenue. This is stuff that originally came from the Bureau of the Census and somebody turned into a chart. And for purposes of this, I've assumed it's correct. But this gives you a sense of how revenues changed during the war. And then this is another chart. This one seems to have more approximations and less real science behind it because they did not have good documentation on where they got their data. But it gives you a sense of comparative size. So one of the other things that we want to look at, because when we start to talk about what are the motivations and approaches of the people involved during the period, when we talk about patriots as well as crown agents, this is the Patriot leadership based on the people in the local congresses and houses of representatives that they had. And you look at the backgrounds. Look at the proportion of farmers, look at the proportion of planters, look at the merchants or traders. Somehow in our game, we want to have some group in each faction that represent the interests of those groups that are different. It's clear that farmers and planters and merchants have very significant motivations. So it's something we have to take into account. We haven't quite got to the detail level on that, but it gives you a sense of how you bring social in. Because notice we're tracking through that PMESII model, okay? And then there's information. Now this is where I'll do my little rant about Ben Franklin being a secret agent, and the question is whose. He was the official postmaster of the colonies for the crown up until the Revolution, and he was very quickly the postmaster for the revolutionaries. What's interesting is he had a network, 75 post offices, all these postal routes, postal agents. And I want to point out two interesting things that we discovered along the way. As the postmaster, Ben Franklin had the franking privilege, just like congressmen do today, and that was a big era right after the Revolution. Congressmen had it. So he was basically sending out circular letters and other documents worldwide. He was a great propagandist, and this was a position that gave him huge capabilities. It's part of how he became famous in Europe in scientific circles and got involved in the Royal Academy and all that other good stuff. But this is, yeah, Ben Franklin goes postal. That's a nice comment from one of the audience. It is remarkable. So when the other thing to look at is their infrastructure. These are the main roads in the colored chart, and you can see the other one shows a little bit more detail. Those were the main methods of overland transportation, and that has a control on flow of traffic and information. So we've got to take that into account in our adjudication in terms of the speed of information getting somewhere, because crossing the Appalachians is going to be slow. Going overland is going to be a lot slower than by schooner or cutter or messenger. And the question is, what messages have to go by what means? It's going to sometimes be an impact for tactical, military, and political issues in the game. So weather is another issue, and this is how they sort of gauged winters at Valley Forge. They actually have this on the national park site, just to give you a benchmark, but that's something we know we need to take into account. Don't know all the details. Getting climate data is going to be an issue. The terrain thing is primarily going to link to the prior charts, where there are roads and where they're not. Okay. The other thing I'm trying to get a good set of charts on is where the passes are through the Appalachians that were open during the period. The Great Valley Road is the main one that you'll see, which is sort of the green one. So that was one of the main methods to go across. Even though Cumberland Pass was there, that didn't become a popular or terribly effective route until after the Revolution. So those are key pieces. The other parts of that is transportation. Now, this is something I found along the way that shocked me. Did you know that George Washington and Braddock's expedition was the first significant use of the Conestoga wagon? They were buying them from Conestoga, Pennsylvania, and they took them on the 7 Years' War as they went out against the French. I just thought that was really interesting. And then here's the other key when we talk about communication, particularly the Atlantic. So they took 6 to 8 weeks, and the fastest I ever saw was 6. But what's really interesting is, let's say you've got a letter from Vienna, Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville. It'd take over 3 months. A week to go to Hamburg, a week to go to London, a week waiting in port, 8 weeks to cross the ocean, a week to go from Norfolk to Charlottesville. That has a huge impact, because it means if something happens in America, it takes 3 months for that news to really get to Europe, and 3 more months for the reaction of Europe to come back, not including the decision time on the other end, which is a good reason why we've pretty much determined that having crown players based in England is not a good idea for our game. Again, there's time. Now, this is probably one of my more complicated charts, but it's to sort of explain how NSDM does things. you have to take time into account when you're planning a professional game, both in terms of game length and in terms of what I call time telescoping. Because there are times you're going to want to stretch the clock so that people can have debates, and times you're going to want to compress the clock so they don't wait 3 months for that answer from England if there's nothing else going on. You just skip right to it. That's one of the things we do very well within SDM. And when we go to professional venues, sometimes astonishes people, because we've even done variable time between cells where the cells didn't realize we had them out of sync. And the real issue that you come into with a lot of this is balancing training time against game time, and complexity, and distilling complexity into the essential simplicities to fit within your time period. So when we deal with our games, the 4-hour games, for example, we do a 20-minute in brief, a 20-minute out brief, and what I call the 1-minute teaching moment during the course of the game. When you need to know how something works, you get to know how something works. Because there's just not enough time to make it work. But what that also means is we have sort of that Twilight Zone effect, and that we can bounce in and out and control time in order to make the game move more expeditiously and have it be fun. So essentially what we've just done in this discussion so far is walk through how the PMESII-PT model can be used to help design your game. It helps ensure that you comprehensively cover the subjects. It's not a guarantee you're going to do it right, but it is a way to guarantee that you're probably not going to do it wrong. That's a better way of saying that. So now the last couple things I want to talk about is how we turn this into our game, okay? And I'm assuming not everybody in the audience is familiar with NSDM, but essentially we're a live action LARP. And we have to educate our players on everything they need to know at the beginning, have handouts that manage that, have trained adjudicators that can deal with the subject matter involved, and basically that's what moves the game forward. So when we talk about preparing for a game, we basically talk about what instruction we have to have available, what kind of read-aheads, if that's the case. We do that with a lot of our experimental and our college games. The game mechanics in brief, where we talk about basic things like you're all social groups and you have agendas, and you want to try to remake the world in your own vision. What I call Gestalt in briefs, which is to try to get you into the mindset. So for example, for the American Revolution, we're going to have a talk about mercantilism. It's going to have to be discussed and going to have to be pounded into people. When we talk about the British military commanders and civil commanders, we're going to talk about bringing colonists to heel. And we're going to try to inculcate that mindset so that we get a more accurate representation of how people would act. You're never going to be perfect. Our games are really good on choices and circumstance. Where it breaks down is on culture and mindset, because you can't make a bunch of Americans think like they're Indonesians or British during the Revolution in a very precise way. We just have to make our best attempt to do it, because what happens in the course of the game is people get insights and they start to understand some of the things that went on during the period. Also, if we have faction guidelines, like how a faction, like a state or state group, will make decisions on legislation or something like that. 1-minute teaching moments happen during the game, so we have to know what those are and what things we need to educate people on. And then time at the end of the game for our after-action review. You also want to control your event space, which means we have maps. We use news feeds, which are electronic now instead of old whiteboards. Although for flavor, there might be an advantage to doing a physical news feed for an American Revolution game. And we have to have distinct areas for the different groups to muster and have conversation. And then we do a lot with player aids. In our games, we have player cards that talk about motives, goals, and abilities, and their roles and positions, because roles are fixed. That's your social group or whatever. And positions like you're the president or you're the logistician for the military. So you have wagons and cattle and oxen and donkeys and whatever. Action sheets for the players to document what they're doing. And the reason we use action sheets is to be sure that the staff knows what people want to get a decision on and then can get a decision on it, because there's a tangible physical item that we all know we have to deal with. policy and budget elements, which sometimes we run as extra economic models, particularly in our longer games. And now we're talking about a course of action menu during a revolutionary game, because people might not know what the normal defaults that their staff and their education would tell them they could choose to do. And then the staff needs to be trained. We need to teach them what they can facilitate, the stuff on the era background, the things we're going to do for the scenario, because in our contemporary games, for example, we may play with a particular advance in technology, and we'll talk about, okay, we're going to introduce this and this and this that's outside control of the players, and they can do these things that may influence the rate of change or the direction of change, any unique mechanics that we have for the game, and any special capabilities or cards, like you suddenly discover 200 cannons that the English left behind at the last battle, something like that. So that's the kind of stuff we have to prepare to take the game model and convert it into a physical game. So that's another part of the professional process that you go through. Oh, and now we pretty much came to the end, so we need to talk about, if you want to become a professional in this business or get exposed to professionals, here are things to think about. Number one, you should consider coming to a Connections Wargaming conference. And some of our staff are heavily involved in that process, self in particular. There's going to be a Connections USA conference this summer in the DC area. And if you go to this link, you can find out more about it. Also, there's going to be an online Connections in April, which you'll be able to follow information on ACDC, because our host Brant is heavily involved with myself and some others on that. If you're interested in even more hardcore professional stuff, you can join the Military Operations Research Society, which also has a wargaming certificate program, which is really great. And if you want to be a serious designer, it's a great start. And then, of course, there's the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, excuse me, that run regular presentations about once a week on wargaming topics. So please take advantage of those things. But most importantly, to close out, we need you. We're a bunch of volunteers. We do this for free. If you want to work hard, play hard, lose money, learn new things, and hang out with interesting people, we're the guys for you. So keep in mind, we're out there. Hey, wave at everybody, guys. Put you back on screen. So, basically, we want you to join us, because it's the only way we get to do this cool stuff. So that's really all we've got. Does anybody have any questions? Questions are welcome. I know there's at least 10 of you there working with us right now. Don't be shy. We don't bite much or hard. Okay, so I'm going to say there's no more questions, and we're going to thank you all for coming. Hope you learned something along the way, and you follow us at various conventions and sites. If you're interested in having us come to your place, contact us via our Facebook page. And if you want to join the team, contact us via the Facebook page. Send us a private message, and we'll get back to you post haste. Oh, I see one last thing. What do we got? So I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you elaborate?
Maybe he's referring to the giant robots.
Well, it could be that, how do we get giant robots? And the answer is only in a science fiction game, and generally only a dragon.
I think Charles Lee might have been a giant robot.
Yeah, I think it would be neat. We have a giant robot of Doug. That would be particularly interesting.
Or technology the Native Americans
Right.
had, but we didn't know about. Just they came out of the West.
Yes.
I think what happened with that other question there was that somebody returned prematurely and was about to tell us what the question was.
Here we go. How do you work time management when playing with no turns? It's very simple. We use benchmarks. Okay. Essentially, there's certain things that we know we wanted to introduce that are timeline events. But by managing the players, basically, if they need more time to discuss, we'll delay when we introduce that in terms of game time. If they need less time, we move it forward. But the other thing we always watch is the overall game, the time we have to complete the game. So in some cases, we will talk to the players and say, for play purposes, we need you to make this decision or we're going to move on. And we try to do that in as fair and reasonable way as we can. With 4-hour games, it's a real challenge. We really like to run 6 and 8-hour games. 6 seems to be the sweet spot because people don't get exhausted. The games are very engaging and emotionally draining for both the staff and the players. When they hit about hour 7, everybody starts to flag. So, we like to sort of keep that. But in a 6-hour game, they have time for long-range planning to bear fruit, which we really like. In a 4-hour game, you generally have to go for quick wins. So does that answer your question? I hope it does. All right. Well, I think we've wound down, so we're going to end the broadcast. We want to thank you all for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of ACDC's convention and keep an eye out for Connections events and our events that we will post on our Facebook page. Bye for now.